7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. Hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast, and today we welcome Heather R. Darsie to discuss her brand new book. I'm super excited about this as an organiser of the Katharine of Aragon Festival. It's a brand new book on Katharine. It is Katharine of Aragon, Spanish Princess. I am not as simple as I may seem. But how are you doing, Heather?
Hello, it's so nice to be here, and thank you for having me on.
No worries. No, I'm super excited to get stuck in your book. We've already had a fantastic conversation anyway. But I think the first question I want to ask you, very cliche, but what inspired you to write this book?
I am interested overall in people who individuals interested in Tudor history would be familiar with. So for Katharine, of course, she's from Spain, so why not look more into her family? And also when we read about Henry VIII, or when we think about Henry VIII's family, we so often go back to the founding of the Tudor dynasty and how that came about. And we think about the Wars of the Roses quite often, or we might even go back to the beginning of the 15th century. And I thought, where did Catherine's family dynasty come from? How did they come onto the scene? And so when I started researching that, I was so interested in it, and just to learn about how they came into power and how dynamic things were on the Iberian Peninsula, which has modern day Spain and Portugal in it. Just wow. And I knew that I wanted to share it. There's just so much that happened. And I imagine that if Katharine knew even just a tiny bit about the family history of her parents and even her grandparents, that could have influenced some of her behavior in England. And so that's what inspired me to write the book.
I think that's a really nice way of getting into learning about Katharine and her family, because it is such an interesting thing to go and look at. But also, a lot of those stories about Katharine are very Anglo-centric and Anne-centric as well, which, you know, is kind of tough considering she had a huge life before Anne and she wasn't actually English. So I think, firstly, we need some context around some of the main places that are within your book, particularly Aragon and Castile. Could you just tell us what these two kingdoms are and how they kind of are important to this family?
Yes, so they were separate and distinct territories. So you had the Crown of Castile and Leon, and overall there were multiple kingdoms in medieval Spain, and they went through different consolidations and different separations. And I'm probably going to repeat myself with this a lot throughout this podcast. You can read more about it in my book. But there are lots of different separations and consolidations. And by the time that Katharine of Aragon's parents were born, you had the Crown of Castile and Leon, which were two separate kingdoms, but that were kind of unified, but had little other territories within them. And then you had the Crown of Aragon, which is the same idea, and it had other principalities and kingdoms within it as well. So they're almost like two large administrative bodies, primarily located on the Iberian Peninsula. Katharine of Aragon's great uncle, so her paternal grandfather's brother, had done a bit to bring Sicily into the fold, and then her father was trying to hold on to it as well. But they're two different, almost administrative bodies. So they're the crowns and not necessarily the kingdoms. And then they were developed, they're sometimes referred to as the two Spains. So they were two different autonomous bodies that were separate from each other. And then when Ferdinand II of Aragon, so Catherine of Aragon's dad, married Isabella of Castile and Leon, she's Isabella I because there's a subsequent Isabella a couple centuries later. Those two crowns, the Crown of Castile and Leon and the Crown of Aragon, remained separate, but because Isabella and Ferdinand were married, they were flowed together more often than not. Castile and Leon was still more powerful and more wealthy and larger than Aragon. And then there were some things that kind of happened when Isabella died that made it a bit tricky for Katharine, which I'm sure we might get into, or I'm sure we'll get into that. But overall, that's what they were. So they weren't actually unified until Catherine of Aragon's nephew, Charles I of Spain, who became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, took over Castile and Leon and Aragon at the same time. And then there was a formal unification some centuries later, not unlike what we see with the history of England and Scotland and the unification of the crowns.
And there seems to be, and given that you're drawing that parallel, I might continue on it now. There seems to be a lot of parallels between the histories of Aragon and Castile and England.
Yeah, from what I can tell, I don't know that this might sound silly. I don't know that I'm excellent at that specifically, but from what I can tell, I would say so.
And when we look at these families as well, they seem to be kind of warring, going after one another, not being particularly nice to each other, which is very medieval from their treatment of one another.
Catherine's grandfather, paternal grandfather, was a horrible person. He was a horrible person. He was probably, if we want to throw shade at Henry VIII and call him paranoid and awful, Henry VIII didn't make his children get dead so that
No.
he could keep territory. Catherine of Aragon's paternal grandfather, his children kept dying. It was so weird.
It's such a bizarre dynasty. So when they're trying to empower themselves and not look after their children, how has this dynasty become so powerful? But then also, how are they interacting with other kingdoms? Because obviously, if you have such a horrible person there who's possibly killing off their children, how are other regimes and other kingdoms and the crowns reacting to that?
During the medieval period, and then looking particularly at the 14th and 15th centuries leading into the 16th, because that's mostly what I was focusing on, there was a lot of intermarrying on the peninsula. So you see a lot of going back and forth between the Aviz dynasty from Portugal and then the predecessor dynasty there. And you'll have to excuse me. Sometimes I say dynasty, sometimes I say dynasty. I say it back and forth. Just it's how I talk. I'm sorry. And then you have the Trastamaras, who took over from the prior ones, and then you have the other francophone, like the French ones coming in and out, but they're all intermarrying, so it's all intermingled, but they're all kind of staying in that same general area, so they're not really expanding outward. And then when Isabella and Ferdinand come in, and not that they're avoiding, I should back up a little bit. Not that those families aren't trying to bring in new people, it's just that they haven't really needed to because they're able to stay in that kind of general area and reach into France a little bit. We do have Catherine of Aragon's uncle Charles, Prince of Viana, who she never met because it's a paternal uncle, of course, marries Agnes of Cleves, who was a distant relative of Anna of Cleves. So we do see some people coming in from Germany. We also see Portuguese princesses who were cousins of Catherine of Aragon's families marrying into the Holy Roman Imperial family. So we already have that connection. So, for example, when Juana of Castile, Catherine of Aragon's sister, then marries Philip the Handsome, they're already cousins. So there's they kind of relied on their same familial connections. So there wasn't a ton of branching out already by the time Catherine of Aragon was born. And I hope I'm making sense, because sometimes I feel like I go off on these tangents because I see all the branches in my head. And then when we get to Catherine of Aragon, there'd been attempts before to try and make alliances with England. There had been an attempt for Isabel and Ferdinand with their older children to try and make marital alliances with Edward IV, but then he dies. And then there was instability with Richard III and Henry VII, and things settled down. Little Catherine's born as the last child between Isabella and Ferdinand. She has her slightly older sister, Maria. That's her sister that's next closest in age to her. So they then resume the communication with England because they want to secure these trade routes. They want to make it easier to have Spanish merchant ships going between Spain and the Netherlands. England wants better trade going between England and the Netherlands. You've got Juana of Castile now is up in the Netherlands. Everybody just wants to play nicely with the Netherlands, even if Maximilian von Habsburg, who eventually becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, kind of wants to be a jerk to Henry sometimes, kind of wants to be a jerk to, and by Henry, I mean Henry VII, kind of wants to be a jerk to Isabella and Ferdinand sometimes. That's the whole goal that Isabella and Ferdinand have by the time we get to Catherine of Aragon and Arthur Tudor is, hey, if we can marry one of our two little princesses, Maria or Catherine, into the English royal family, that'll help us with our trade routes. and help us also gain more control of this vital English channel there. Help us go against the French, or at least have some control over the French. Nobody likes the French at this point. Sometimes they like the French. Most of the time they don't. But also, we're going to go in a slightly different direction. Everybody, I think, is aware that Henry VII kind of had a tenuous grasp on the throne. And so I believe, in my opinion, it is more accurate to say that he gained the throne of England through right of conquest. In my opinion, you can say the same thing about Isabella regarding the crown of Castile and Leon. She usurped it from her niece.
Could we go into that a bit more then? Because
Absolutely.
obviously, right now we're looking at, there's this misconception that we have is that Spain or Castile and Aragon are very secure. You've got two very secure rulers, and you've got a very unstable England coming out of the Wars of Roses. But right now, you're breaking that misconception.
I don't think they were that stable. I think they were powerful. I think they were strong. Isabella was the daughter from a second marriage of the king of John II of Castile and Leon. Her brother Henry IV was the son from the first marriage. Henry IV had difficulty conceiving children. He conceived one child. I think I call her Joanna in the book. Her name was Juana. I will refer to her as Juana here. Juana la Beltraneja. And I apologize for my poor Spanish accent. There were lots of rumors about who the father was of Juana la Beltraneja, and she received that epithet, la Beltraneja, because it alluded to another man at court. And part of the problem was Henry IV of Castile and Leon, so Isabella of Castile and Leon's sister-in-law, that woman really loved to flirt with men, and she was very flagrant about it. And so at one point, Henry IV just repudiated her, got rid of her. She goes to live in a castle somewhere, takes up with a servant boy there, and has has a set of twins. So she did nothing to help her little daughter, Juana la Beltraneja. On top of this, Henry IV, Isabella's older brother, did not have a spine. He would not stand up to his nobles. He just wanted to make everyone happy. He probably would have been much happier being a cleric. He was not very interested in being a king. He was very smart. He just kind of didn't care. So he didn't really stand up for his daughter. Isabella was an adult by the time that Henry passed away, whereas her little niece, Juana la Beltraneja, was about 12. So Isabella had already been married to Ferdinand secretly and behind her brother's back, and had children. Little Juana was 12. So a civil war starts, and we can guess who won that civil war. But from all the information that I've been able to find, and there's no real way to prove this without an actual paternity test, but from the information I've been able to find, there's no reason to think that Juana was not her father's child. But again, Juana's mother did nothing to help her in this situation, and it just seemed more expedient to have Isabella be the next monarch. So Isabella and Ferdinand stole Castile and Leon from Isabella's niece, and you have two different kingdoms. You have usurper monarchs. You have Henry VII of England, and you have Isabella of Castile and Leon. And so part of what I think was going on when they were marrying their children to each other is they were also saying, yes, you are the rightful monarch in your area. And I recognize that. Let's marry our children together. That's, of course, we don't have anybody's journals of these are my feelings and this is my motivation, but that to me would signify that. That's part of the reason why they were intermarrying their children, would be to partially signify that, yes, this is how we're mutually respecting the other's position.
And then how did those conversations or those correspondence between Henry and Ferdinand and Isabella go when they're trying to negotiate that marriage between Arthur and Catherine?
It took a long time. Part of it had to do with the children being so young, and then part of it concerned spats between Henry VII and Maximilian von Habsburg, who of course married his children Philip von Habsburg, known as the Handsome, and Margaret of Austria, or Margaret von Habsburg, to Catherine's siblings, Juana of Castile and Juan, Prince of Girona and Prince of Asturias. The Prince of Girona is the heir apparent to Aragon, like the Prince of Wales is the heir apparent to England. And the Prince of Asturias is the heir apparent to Castile and Leon. So Juan had both titles. So it was just kind of this little mess of these people having spats. And then you also had the Perkin Warbeck stuff come on scene. It appears that Henry VII used the negotiations with Isabella and Ferdinand to execute some people up in England, but it was all very protracted. And then the next issue, again, waiting for the kids to be old enough to actually get married. So sometimes children would be legally married when they were quite young, but they wouldn't be sent to go live with their spouse until they were of an appropriate age. The next issue was Catherine could not speak any language that in common with Arthur. There was some attempt to have her learn French. So I mentioned before that Isabella and Ferdinand had their son Juan, the Prince of Girona and Asturias, marry Maximilian von Habsburg's daughter, Margaret of Austria. Unfortunately, Juan died not very long after marrying Margaret, which left Margaret at the Spanish court for some time. Margaret spoke French, and so Henry VII had hoped that perhaps Catherine could learn some French before she went into England. It does not appear that that happened or that that meaningfully happened, but that was some of it too, was just trying to figure out what do we do with her? Do we raise her at the English court? Does she stay in Spain? It seems at the time, and this could be some nationalism, which there's nothing wrong with being proud of your country, but there was, on the one hand, Spain was regarded as a better place to keep her, but on the other hand, once she was of a sufficient age to send her to England, it was suggested that maybe we need to send her right now before she becomes too accustomed to Spanish governance and then has to go learn the English style of governments, which I think the Spanish frowned upon.
I mean, I don't blame them. I know where I would have preferred to have spent that time. I would have much preferred to be in warm, sunny Spain as opposed to in England. But then, she's made that trip across. She's landed in all places in Plymouth. What's the kind of? I really feel bad for her. But what's the reaction to her kind of arrival? But then, you mentioned there's language difficulties there, and her trying to learn those skills. How do they try and get around that when she's in England?
It was very joyful, but also unexpected. She was not supposed to land there. So she kind of made this slow plodding progress to where she was supposed to get to, but it seemed that everyone was very, very delighted and happy and excited that she was there. I'm sure she was relieved. She had a horrible journey across the Bay of Biscay there and getting up to where she needed to go. So they had plans, I think, at Southampton, hoping she would land there. And she just I assumed that the navigators and the ship captains just got tired of dealing with the weather and just wanted to get to England, and it didn't really matter where. But she received a warm reception, as best of a reception as she could, from what I can tell, when she landed. As far as the language barrier, she did have people with her who could speak Latin, and so there's some anecdotes, particularly when she first met Arthur, where they both could write in Latin. And so there were a couple times that they exchanged letters in Latin, so they could write it, but the way they pronounced it was different enough that they couldn't understand each other. And so she would speak, we don't know if she spoke in Latin or spoke in Spanish, but she would speak to her religious figure, who would then speak in Latin to his religious figure, who would then speak it in English, is my understanding of how it worked. I don't know if they were all just speaking different types of Latin or exactly what was going on, but it was her with her translator, him with his translator, and it was kind of a square translation and not like a triangular translation, if that makes sense.
It's just a long chain just to make any form of communication viable. So when she's trying to navigate that, Henry's trying to navigate that, Arthur's trying to navigate that as well. There's also the issue of actually having to get married, and when does that marriage happen? How does it happen? And then what happens immediately afterwards, because there seems to be a couple of issues between Henry and Ferdinand back in.
It happens fairly soon after she lands. So it must have been an absolute whirlwind of a time. She had a spectacular probably 3 weeks, and I'll get into detail about that, but she had a pretty spectacular 3 weeks and then was immediately thrust into difficulty from what I can tell. So she lands in England, spends some time getting across to an appropriate place, gets brought into London, relaxes for a couple days, and then she has her what could be likened to a joyous entry into London. And I go into a lot of detail from that. I use the Receipt of Lady Catherine, which I think most people who are familiar with Katharine of Aragon are familiar with that book, but it's a festival book, so it was created specifically to record that event. And it also has details about her wedding and, unfortunately, I think we're all aware of this with Arthur Tudor, but about Arthur Tudor's passing and a few other things. But I have transcribed large portions of it into modern English, excuse me, so that we can enjoy it a bit more and appreciate the pageants more. Part of the reason why I did that was because we always read about Anne Boleyn's pageants when she became queen. I'm like, let's read about Catherine of Aragon's pageants when she entered into England. So those are in there. But really, really fantastic, mind-blowing pageantry. I mean, if I would have seen those things today, I would have been blown away. And to have that level of festivity and expense back then, I know that people assume that Henry's a miser. He was extremely good at getting money, and he was very, very clever at negotiating. Catherine's parents were not. But to say that he was a miser, I mean, if you just read what was spent on celebrating the fact that she just was in London and was getting ready to marry Prince Arthur, my goodness, they thought of everything. And so she goes from that to marrying the prince, and then there is the formal consummation ceremony where they legally consummate, which doesn't mean that they demonstrably consummated, to put it in a very PG or G fashion, but they ceremonially consummate in front of witnesses. And by that I mean, for example, we're going to go to my favorite queen, Anna of Cleves. Anna of Cleves' brother Wilhelm, when he was in his knees, married Jeanne d'Albret, the Francis I of France's niece. She was 12 when he married her. So to legally consummate the marriage, she laying in the bed with, a nightgown on, and he took his shoe and his sock off and put his foot on the bed. So it was more akin to something like that. There's not really details in the book, but I would imagine that was most likely what happened with Catherine and Arthur. So they legally consummated the marriage. So we know that happened. The rest of it, it's weird to speculate on what 15-year-olds do, I think. So then afterwards, there's like a week of jousting and festival and feasting and excitement, and every day there's something to do. And Catherine's not at every single thing, but just insane amounts of festivities. And then everyone goes home. And Henry VII notices, I think, that she's sad. And so he has his jeweler or somebody bring all these trinkets and costly trinkets, has her pick her favorite one, and then her ladies can each pick one that they want because he feels bad for her.
I mean, I like that you've absolutely broken down so many. Sorry, that's the dog. So many misconceptions that we have about this period. Breaking down that Henry's not miserly, and actually this huge amount of spending is perhaps a performance of showing his legitimacy as well. But then, taking that period after that marriage, after that legal consummation, why does she have to head off to Ludlow in Wales with Arthur?
Well, he has to go back because traditionally that is where the Prince of Wales practices becoming king. That is where they practice administering a government. That is also why, going forward much farther in history, when Catherine of Aragon's daughter Mary is sent to Wales, that was an honor for Mary to go do that because Henry was priming Mary for becoming a monarch. She just wasn't given the title of Princess of Wales. But that's why Arthur Tudor had to go back there. There was discussion of keeping Catherine at court because it would be easier for her to learn the customs of England, particularly what was expected of English women and an English queen, by having Catherine in the presence of an English queen, which she would not be if she were in Wales or she were in Ludlow. There wasn't a discussion of Arthur has too frail of health, we need to keep her here. It was more, it seems like it might make more sense to keep Catherine here where there's more women. It might be more seemly to keep her here. And again, presumably to learn how to be an English queen and learn English feminine culture rather than send her out to this border area where she might not get the proper education or finishing, if you will, for a future Queen of England.
And I think that was an interesting discussion that you've had, and you just spoke to us, because something that's always struck me about Catherine is that she has such an incredible royal apprenticeship almost with her mother, Isabella, showing the power of monarchy alongside her father, Ferdinand. But then to have that kind of stark contrast with not having too much experience or positive experience of monarchy in England is something that's really struck me.
She didn't really get any training in England, to me, from what I can tell, because she goes to Ludlow. Arthur Tudor passes away. She's kind of stuck there for a couple months before she's brought back to London and closer to court. But she's not always around Elizabeth of York. Then Elizabeth of York passes away. So she never really gets a good chance, in my opinion, to learn how to be an English queen, because the only chance she had, she didn't take advantage of. Understandably so, because Catherine wanted to be around her husband, and I think we all remember being 15 and being passionate and silly. So it makes sense. Why would I want to hang out with this old lady? I've got all the time in the world to do that. I want to go hang out with my husband. It makes total sense. Even as adults, we'd probably want to go hang out with our new spouse rather than our in-law right away. But so she never really had a good opportunity to learn how to be an English queen. She just had to kind of make it up as she went when it was finally her turn.
And Elizabeth of York was never particularly well during the periods where she could have spent that time with her either.
She had gone through a lot. She had lost a child, and then she had her pregnancy. And I don't know a whole lot about Elizabeth of York, quite frankly, so I can't fully answer that, just to be honest. Yeah, I don't know how available she would have been, but at least Catherine would have seen what court culture was like, or she would have been able to be around Elizabeth's attendants, understand more what was expected of her, understand how to instruct her own maids of honor when she became queen. Not that Catherine did a poor job when she became queen, but it just might have been an easier transition for her because she would have had an apprenticeship type opportunity with Elizabeth of York, which she completely missed out on through no fault of her own. It's just that's what happened.
So from that moment, Arthur's died. Probably could have been one of her biggest advocates in England, Elizabeth. There's so many Elizabeths and Catherines in this period. Elizabeth has also passed away. What happens to Catherine in this limbo? How's Henry treating her? How's her parents treating her? Because it's such a difficult time in Catherine's life.
Well, this is where the great debacle of what to do with her starts, of course. So thankfully, the Tudors have one other son. The problem is when Arthur Tudor died, the other son was 10 years old. So Isabella is still alive. Ferdinand is still alive. And they are thinking, hey, she's in England. Maybe we can have Catherine marry Henry. We've had our daughters marry the same future monarch over in Portugal. We do that kind of stuff all the time down here in the Iberian Peninsula. This will be fine. So they start planning this out. But the issue is Henry VII wants the rest of his dowry. I will not go into the details of that in this podcast because you can read about it in the book. But overall, the document itself concerning the dowry is why it was extremely difficult for Ferdinand to send money into England to care for Catherine. On top of that, some of the items that were sent with Catherine to help pay for Catherine's support, but also to put towards the dowry. Nobody ever checked what the value of those items would be in England. And this is where Henry was clever. So Ferdinand and Isabella are like in Castile and Aragon and Leon. Sorry, I said that backwards. Castile and Leon and Aragon. This is what these items are worth. They did not confirm what the items were worth in England. So Henry, being clever, maybe a bit of a jerk. Well, I'm sorry, but these do not have the same value here in England. They are worth far less. So you have a bit of that happening as well. But the biggest issue, the two biggest issues facing Catherine at that time, immediately afterwards, were the poor language of the dowry and the fact that the next available heir was 10. So she had to wait for little Henry to grow up. And that meant turning 14 years old. So either way, there's going to be at least 4 years of her waiting. And he turned 11 that summer. So realistically, it was maybe 3 years. But still, that's a long time. And especially if she's already 16 years old and she's like, what's going on in my life? She's got to wait for this kid to grow up. That's a long time.
So, when Henry VII passes away in 9, she's wasted so long in this limbo, this almost form of purgatory in England, which is cold, wet, miserable compared to the place that she's growing up in Spain. What does she do? What does Henry do that perhaps makes the situation a bit better for her?
I think he had the most romantic overture in his entire life. I think that Henry did a lot of naughty things. I think Henry was a paranoid person. I don't think he's this megalomaniac, narcissistic serial killer that we like to talk about. I think that when you go back and look at legal documents and political documents and what was happening around Henry and not specifically just reading everything and taking it for face value, the stuff he did made sense. Doesn't mean you have to like it, but it made sense. So once you put things in context of what was actually happening and not just what was written down, because history is written by the victors. It's just now, thankfully, in the 21st century, we have the internet, so we can know both sides a lot better rather than just what one person was writing. So when you actually look at what was going on, I think Henry had the opportunity to watch this beautiful, beleaguered, exotic princess grow up in his kingdom, and he had a chance to save her. He knew her. He was probably comfortable with her. And everything happened very, very quickly. And Catherine probably, and they were betrothed too, so that wasn't an issue either. It had kind of gone back and forth a little bit, but Henry knew that at least off and on, he and Catherine were supposed to be getting married, and so he just kind of went through with it. And then they had a very, very tiny, very, very quiet ceremony, certainly quiet compared to her first ceremony with Arthur Tudor. And that was that. And then they had a coronation.
I think Henry's treatment of Catherine, your work that you're showing at the beginning, definitely shows Henry to be romantic and to be caring in an extent that he's not 20 years later. How powerful.
And I would disagree with you on that, because I think that, so part of what I found with Anna of Cleves, and I'm sorry to go on that tangent, but for example, when he annuls his marriage with Anna of Cleves, that was done for political reasons, and he gives Anna all this stuff. And I think the reason why he did that is Anna, she would have been trapped in England for political reasons and would have been destitute, much like what he saw Katharine of Aragon go through.
Treatment between the similarities in the treatment between the two. For me, it doesn't go amiss that they're both got ties to foreign powers.
Yes.
Which are incredibly important to Henry.
So I think that him watching Catherine suffer is why he was nice to Anna in the end and adopted her. So just wanted to throw that in there. So I don't, and again, and I realize this is a bit of a tangent, we're supposed to be talking about Catherine, but when we look at what Henry did, particularly, definitely post 1527, but especially post 1533, it makes a lot more sense when you look at the context of the world he was living in and not just the papers from like one incident.
Yeah, and I think when you look at Henry, like, I don't subscribe to this theory that Henry fell off a horse and was suddenly a different person. I don't subscribe to that theory, but I think the type of person he was being very passionate, very, very forthright with his emotions and his opinions. It kind of shapes the way that he reacts to different people across that whole age. And then, the way that he responds to cardinals and archbishops also kind of shows that. So when she is emerging as this queen, being the queen that Henry needs at the beginning of his reign, how is he allowing her to be forthright and show her power in a way that he perhaps didn't really let many other people do? Because she seems to be a very powerful queen.
He seemed to be okay with her being involved. She was very well educated, and I'm not sure if this is responsive to your question, but she was very well educated. She was interested in the arts. She certainly had influence at court, so he didn't seem to expect her to shut herself away and just be quiet and make babies. When he went to go fight in France, he put her in charge. He made her the regent, so she was the de facto monarch, if you will, while he was off fighting in France. And I like to think, because of her and her strength and her willingness to help support him, that led to the victory at the Battle of Flodden very, very early on during their marriage. And it would have taken a lot of trust, and I think it showed a lot of respect for who she was and her intelligence, because I don't know that he would have done that with Catherine Howard, who was much younger, and she was certainly much younger than Katharine of Aragon was at the time, and Catherine Howard's mom was no Isabella of Castile and Leon.
Yeah, yeah. I think those kind of differences in attitude between Henry and Catherine, and Henry, and I hate to use this phrase, his other 5 wives.
Yeah. Well, when we look at Katharine of Aragon, she's the only full-blown daughter of monarchs compared to all the other ones. And so she was the only one who expected to marry a king or somebody very powerful, or who would be expected to marry a king or somebody very powerful. The other 5 just kind of fell into it by accident. Anna of Cleves' family, she should have married down, because that's what was expected of German princesses at the time. So Catherine was the only one equipped to do it. And when the occasion arose, she knew exactly what to do, because that's what she was trained to do. She had her mother's example and her mother's memory, and she did it every time. And I think that's part of the reason why it was such an insult when Henry said, "Hey, we only have a daughter. There's not really any precedent in England for this. I know there was that whole Matilda mess. I need a boy. This isn't good enough." And she's probably thinking, "Sir, my mother is Isabella of Castile and Leon. Her granddaughter is Mary. What is the problem here?" Because there was no law against having a queen regnant. So it just would have been absolutely baffling, I think, for Catherine on multiple levels as to why Henry would just say, "This one's not good enough." And also, when we think about the laws of Spain, women could inherit in Spain in ways that women could not in England. So overall inheritance laws, and this is broad strokes, everyone, so bear with me. I can't really get into the nuances, and I don't get into the nitty-gritty nuances in my book, but broad strokes, the inheritance rights overall in Spain at the time were different from what we have at the time in England. And overall, women could inherit things in Spain in the ways that women could not in England. And so there was a tradition of women inheriting in Spain in general that did not exist in England. And so that would support Henry's paranoia, but also would lead to what I assume was Catherine's feeling of being flabbergasted at Henry's ridiculousness, because there wasn't actually a law on the books saying that Mary couldn't be queen, but there were these different legal traditions that might have caused somewhat of a cultural clash between the two.
And I can hardly imagine that was the first time that Catherine was absolutely flabbergasted at something Henry did, said, or whatever. But then, in terms of looking at legal issues, I'm not going to get into the great matter, because, we need 5 hours to get into that. But then there's another misconception that you kind of attack head on in the book. And it's the fact that, the discussion around Henry and Catherine being divorced Was it a divorce? Or what was it? Because I think there's a massive, divorce beheaded died, divorce beheaded survived kind of thing going on.
I believe it was annulled because if you have a divorce, that means that you were legally married and then it was undone. Henry was trying to say that they were never legally married. And just like today, I mean, even today, there's a big difference between an annulment and a divorce. An annulment is like the thing never happened. So that is why Mary became illegitimate. So if you have children while you're married and you become divorced, just like today, your children are legitimate. That would have left Mary in line to the throne. So if Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon would have become divorced, Mary still would have been in line to the throne. And then, of course, Anne Boleyn goes on to have a daughter. Mary still would have been before Elizabeth, in theory. By annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, that makes Mary illegitimate because it's like the marriage never existed. It was a void ab initio. It was void from the start. So the fun little rhyme should be annulled, beheaded, died, annulled, beheaded, survived. It's just, I've been saying this a lot lately, I feel like on podcasts. Usually it's the sexy thing that sticks in people's minds, or it's a sexy storyline that people want to cling to, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean that it's the most accurate thing to cling to. So no, he sought to have the marriage voided effectively, if we can go with that, which would make Mary illegitimate, which of course was a huge blow to everyone. But that would then pave the way for Anne Boleyn, any child that Anne Boleyn had, which of course had to be a boy. We knew she was pregnant and obviously it was going to be a boy. It wasn't. Spoiler alert. But that would have created a problem, though, if it had been a divorce, and there would have been a very strong acknowledgement that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was lawful, that Mary then was lawfully begotten, and that even though the marriage to Catherine was unlawful because Mary was lawfully begotten, she was the firstborn child, therefore she would take precedence over any female child that Anne had, should Anne, God forbid, not have a son. And we all know how that went again. But no, so Henry technically only was married twice when he died. Once to Jane Seymour. That's why he was buried next to her, because she was the only wife of his that was dead. The only legal wife of his that was dead. And then once to Catherine Parr. So technically, Henry only had 2 wives.
No, it's not as bad as history makes it out to be, then.
No.
Now, your book does such a tremendous story breaking down some of the misconceptions that we have about Catherine's early life and some of her family history, which we don't touch on as much as we really should have. But I've got a final fun question for you, Heather, as we do for every guest on the podcast. You discuss such a huge number of figures from English, but also Spanish history within your book. Have you got a favourite person that you looked at, with the exception of Catherine, when you were doing the work for this book?
Juana of Castile. There's a whole big bit in my book on her, and I hope that I have the opportunity, the intelligence, and the acumen to write a book about her someday.
I think that's an awesome, because reading the book, she was such a fantastic character, and I don't want to spoil one of your next books on Juana, but she sounds absolutely incredible. So could you just give us a little tidbit about her?
I don't think she was mad, but I think we might recognize some things about her that we recognize about a lot of individuals today, and I think that was used against her, and I also think that she was pretty much abandoned.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I haven't read some of the details about her life within your book, so no, thank you for that answer. I really implore people to go and buy your book so you can learn more about Juana as well. And then, speaking about grabbing a copy of your book, where can people go to get a copy?
Well, there's the always ubiquitous Amazon. It does come out. So the book is released in the UK or through UK channels on May 15th. If you're in the United States, you can order it through the UK. Blackwell's, I don't know what's going on in the world with shipping today. Just going to throw that out there. But traditionally, Blackwell's has had free or reduced shipping to the United States. I don't know what's happening now, but be aware of that. Or you can order it through amazon.co.uk. If you're in the United States, because I have to look out for my fellow Americans. If you are in the United States, it does come out in October, but it's released May 15th in the UK. You can get it at, I believe, Foyles, Waterstones. You can order it through your favorite bookshops. It might be available at different historical sites. in the UK. And then in the US, you can order it through Barnes & Noble. I think you can even order it through Target if you want to go that way. Throw that in your little shopping cart. And really any booksellers online, I believe.
Well, I'll make sure there's a link.
And of course, the publishers, Amberley Publishing. I should probably say that too, obviously. Sorry, I should probably throw that in there.
Yeah, Philip will tell us off for that.
Yeah.
Now, I'll make sure there's a link for the book in the description below. And then if people want to keep up to date with you and your research, where can they go?
I have my website, maidensandmanuscripts.com. I will say I haven't posted on there in a while, but there's over 200 posts. I haven't posted on there in a while because I've been very busy writing books. I imagine at the end of this year, I'll be able to update it a bit more. That has the best way to contact me because I get those emails directly to my personal email. Otherwise, I have Heather R. Darsie Historian on Facebook, which I probably see the most often. I have at HR Darsie History on Twitter. I have at H Darsie History on Instagram. I forgot my middle initial for some reason on Instagram. I have Blue Sky, but I don't really go on there. I do not have TikTok. What else do I have? I might have some other stuff. I pretty much just use Facebook and Twitter, or excuse me, X. I guess I should call it X. I miss the bird, though. Birds are so cute. Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. Otherwise, if you go to maidensandmanuscripts.com, like I said, there's a bunch of articles on there if you want to read some things. And there is a little bit more about Katharine of Aragon on there too. And there's a contact me link there as well.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure they're in the description below as well, so people can go and follow you and go to the website and catch up with what you're doing. But thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.